Abyssal Murmurs. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next horror stories. Story 1. The Phantom of Centerville. A chilling encounter on a dark country road. This happened earlier, January 2016 this year. My wife's older brother, my brother-in-law, lives in a small town called Centerville. Sia, about 20-30 minutes west of Reading. My in-laws, wife's parents, invited me to take a flight with them to visit their older son and his family. The BIL found some land for sale and wanted us to go see. My in-laws and I flew to Sacramento, CA, and rented a car. We drove for about 2 hours to Reading and rest. When we reached Reading, I felt very nauseous and lightheaded. Same goes for my wife's parents. We decided to take a rest at a local Starbucks in Reading for a good 30 minutes and took some Advil and Tylenols. I quickly felt like the environment there wasn't right, and the vibe there is a little awkward, but I kept my calm and went with the flow. Maybe it could have been the long flight and the drive. After resting, we're on our way to Centerville and on the road again. The road was a mini highway, one lane coming and going. About 10 minutes of driving, a white bird, maybe a seagull, flew right in front of us and slammed right into our windshield. I was driving about 60 mph, and all I could see was feathers flying and blood splashed everywhere. Luckily, there was no crash on the windshield, and I slowed down the car. We parked and checked the car, acknowledging everything, and the three of us were okay. By then, it was around 9:00 p.m., and it was darker than usual because it is in the countryside where no light poles was nearby. I then drove again, going by the speed limit in a small highway, one-lane direction. By this time, we passed a small, weird cemetery, and there I felt goosebumps and cold at that moment. Right after we passed the cemetery, about a mile down, we saw a blonde woman with a white outfit, a long white dress, standing and looking down. She could be in her late 20s to maybe early 30s. My mother-in-law quickly told me to slow down because there is a pedestrian standing with a white dress on the right. In Hmong, she said, Vav Murmurs. Mwaj. Ibtug Pajanium Mecca Sov An Taum Kev. Son-in-law, slow down. There is a white lady standing right there. My father-in-law then quickly responded, What pedestrian? There's no one on the road in Hung. He said, Poje Niam Mecca's tug. To be tis muaje lige tug nyab taum kev sav. Texab dag ma. So he told me to keep driving. White lady where? There is no one there. Don't lie. At this moment, I felt very cold and again felt a little creeped out by it. I quickly asked my father-in-law, Did you see the woman with a white dress standing there on the road? Because I did see one. He responded in Hmong, Kavtis Palm. Tu BTs, Waje Li Jado. Kev CJ Chav Cheb 2J Yabam. I did not see anything. There was nothing there. Continue driving. In my blind spot and view mirror, I can still see the woman slowly disappearing while I am driving away. My MIL again quickly said, Ham Sislo. Muaj. Ibtug Poje Nyam Mecca's Ho. Ansiyog Dab La Sis Poje Tuksug. Exactly. There was a Caucasian woman there. If not ghost, then a Podge Soak. While driving and feeling the creeps, I checked my phone, and there was no service. Both my in-laws' phones also had no services as well. I looked at my FIL and saying to myself, You lying ass. You did see it. It was dark, but I can still see and saw my FIL's face looking constipated and much more nervous than I was. So, about 5-10 miles past that scenario, all of our phones actually worked again. My FIL was able to reach his older son on the phone, and the son directed us to his house. When we arrived, we shook hands, pretending like everything was normal. I quickly asked my BIL if there was a cemetery on the road that we took to his house. And on our way here, we saw a blonde Caucasian woman standing on the right side. He responded, "No, there is no cemetery around the area, nor there is one nearby that he know of." He had been living there for 9 years and had never seen a cemetery on that road or some blonde white woman who will be out hitchhiking this late. During our stay there, I drove on and passed that road and did not see a cemetery. Anyway, I don't know what the hell I put myself into, but this was one of my weirdest and most awkward moments I've experienced. I don't know if my FIL did see the woman and claimed he didn't see her. When I saw his face while driving as he was on the passenger side, his face looked more nervous than I was. Maybe he saw something different and just didn't want to admit it. It is hard to tell. Till this day, he still won't admit that he saw the woman or if he saw a cemetery. He doesn't buy my MIL and my story. My MIL and I saw the woman, and both came to a conclusion that she was indeed a ghost. According to my BIL, he has lived there for 9 years and had never seen a cemetery on that road, nor experienced anything unusual like we did. To sum this up, I now believe in ghosts. I don't know if the woman who my MIL and I saw was a real ghost, or if she was some kind of abnormal supernatural creature. Story 2. Going home. Back when my parents were still in Laos, they gardened for a living. The villagers would exchange labors with one another. If you were too lazy to exchange labor with others, they won't exchange labor with you either. It was the easiest and fastest way to get your garden finished in time for harvesting. My parents had one child at the time, my oldest sister. They worked hard at the garden, which was a few-mile walk. They were behind on their garden due to my mom's dad being sick. They attended my grandpa's bedside for a week. Being a week behind is actually being 2 weeks behind. They were offered an opportunity to help a family out with their garden, and in exchange, the family would help my parents out. The problem was, they lived 10-12 miles away from my parents' village. My parents debated really hard and decided they will leave my sister and grandpa for my uncles to watch. With that decision, they took off to the garden 10-12 miles away. It was a whole day's walk due to mountains and creeks. My parents were gone for about a week. My mom started missing my sister, who was 3 at the time. She cried every day to my dad that she missed her daughter, but my dad said it was too far of a walk to go back just for a quick visit. So with that, they both continued to work for a few more days. Soon again, my mom nagged my dad that she missed my sister. She cried and cried. Finally, my dad said if she really wanted to go home, she'll have to wait for other travelers to cross paths and she can tag along with them. He didn't want her to go by herself. A few more days passed, and some Hmong travelers came to rest at the garden where my parents were working at. They mentioned they had came back from the north exchanging silk and goods with some Chinese people. They were heading back home. Their village was about 20 miles south of my parents' village. They will pass by my parents' village going home. Excited to hear the news, my mom packed up and left with them. My dad told her to be careful and that he will come home in a few days after he finished their promise of labor and when other travelers pass. With that, my mom headed home. They walked that whole day. Finally, they reached the outskirts of my parents' village by late afternoon. It was still 2-3 miles away in the distance. The path came to a Y. The right main road continued to the traveler's village, and the left drifted down a tiny road with thick forest trees and a creek that led to my parents' village. My mom thanked the kind Hmong travelers and headed left down the trail home. She said as soon as the travelers were out of sight, she felt a cold, uneasy feeling. The trail she was on was dark. The trees above cast out a majority of the sunlight. The trees seemed so green but lifeless. There were rumors that trail was once a secret trail to escape the Chinese back in the days. Many had died on the trail. The road didn't seem harmful if a few people were on it, but my mom being by herself, she said it was the coldest feeling she ever felt. She told herself a few more steps and she would be home to her daughter. She came to an area where veins draped the trees and hugged the ground. All of a sudden, she heard crackling noise on her left side like someone was crushing 2 rocks together. The hair on her arm and neck stood right up. She felt a presence. The sky seemed to darken, and the air became chilly. The creek was on her left, down the hill a bit. She glanced down there to see what could it be. She couldn't see much because it was so dark down there. Down a bit more, she saw something green and red. She couldn't make it out. Soon she could see it was a woman-like figure with messy, straw-like hair crouched over crushing rocks. My mom said she had cold, tiny shocks, almost like electricity, all over her body. Her knees were so weak and numb. She couldn't move. The figure seemed to know my mom was there, but it seemed more busy crushing the rocks together. My mom then found the courage to get her thoughts together and prayed to her great ancestors to guide and protect her. With that, she ran so fast. She said when she started running, the figure down by the creek started laughing. It sounded like a little kid's laugh. It echoed through the dark, thick forest. She couldn't say how long it took her to run home, but all she knew was when she got to the edge of town, she felt like she survived the war. She said her hair bun was so drenched in sweat. My grandpa asked if she took a quick swim before she came home. She told my grandpa what happened, and he told her the trail is haunted by the people who lost their lives to the Chinese back in the days, and that many people actually see monkey-like humans there often. My grandpa said if it were the dead day and time to feed, they don't care who sees or bothers them. They only get a small window of opportunity to feast a few times a year. He said the lady was probably crushing crawfishes. My mom couldn't be happier to be home. She got sick, so my grandpa took a few chicken and called her spirit back. My dad came home a few days later, but didn't experience anything. He was with 5 other villagers, and the family they exchanged labor with. The whole village soon forbid anyone to walk that trail alone. Recently, my uncles, who are still back in Laos, told my parents that their old village is now deserted and has become a ghost village cause too many people kept dying. The trail had vanished due to the lack of travelers and human life. It's barely noticeable cause of the veins, moss, and forest life that has taken over. Getting to the village would take a highly skilled, experienced person who knows the lands and mountains very well. So spooky. Story 3. The Dead Follows. First encounter. April 2017. A city in Wisconsin. Want to keep this city anonymous. My friends, let's call them JJ and Yin. This one night, after a long, exhausting day of work, my friends and I wanted to go cruising in the city. For a couple of minutes, we cruised all over town. We kept on driving until we got unfamiliar with some roads. This road had a steep hill, a dark, creepy back road to go around town, and a spooky, isolated dead end. Trees surrounded the trails and roads, and had a deep ditch off of the road. At this time, I don't know why my childish friends put on the song XWAM by the talented Shang Li. It's a creepy song that the rapper himself tells an experience of a ghost encounter in Hmong. Moving on to the story, we decided to drive on the back roads. I was curious about the dead end, so I asked Yin and JJ if they wanted go check out the spooky dead end. Yin and JJ was as curious as I was, so we turned back to observe the spooky dead end. When we got there, I parked my car for a good 2 minutes. All of a sudden, a H, Yin cried. It scared JJ and I, but I decided to drive off. I asked Yin what was wrong, and Yin told they saw a lady sitting on the tree looking down at us. JJ confirmed he saw it too. At first, I thought they were lying. As I was driving off, I blinked for a second, and all of a sudden I ended up at JJ's house. Yin and JJ told me that when I blinked out, they looked at me and I was completely gone. I was possessed by a spirit. I had different voices coming out of me. The spirits wearing my body told them, "You are all going to die tonight." Yin cried, and JJ was going to take a swing to knock some sense out of me. They remember my hum isn't that fluent. After that little incident, I dropped off my friends. JJ first, and then Yin last. After I dropped Yin off, I took a detour to my house. This road I took has a lake on my left, and at the very end of the road has a shelter and a beach. I was driving until I reached the beach area. All I saw was a figure. This figure had massive, messy, thick hair. Its skin was pitch black and had a red sash around her waist. I couldn't see her face. At this end road, I had to turn right. So I turned as this figure was just staring at me as I drove off in the distance. I was kind of freaked out, but I brushed it off, assuring myself maybe it was just someone chilling late at the beach. I told my mother, but my mother also just assured me the same. Second encounter, May 2017. My mother and father told us that it's time we move out to our own place as a family, because we all have been living with our grandma for a long time. To fast forward, July we moved. Our new house had 3 rooms, 2 living rooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen. As we unpacked and settled in, this one night my sister's lights was on. So I turned it off and reiterate that she has to turn off her light when she's not in her room. But she told me she hasn't been turning on the light. And ever since that room turned lights on by itself, my sister also gotten sleep paralysis multiple times. She told Mother, but she doesn't believe her and says it's nothing to be scared of. Nights go on, and my sister decides to sleep somewhere else. So she sleeps in the basement with my little brother ever since. Third encounter, in August. Since I was the oldest son and a former college student, I wanted to move out to live with my grandma again. So for a few weeks, I left to go live with my grandma. My parents and grandma and us lived together in a duplex. So then we used to live upstairs. Entering the building, there is a set of stairs to go upstairs to your left, and then a set of stairs going down the basement to the far left. Straight across is my grandma's house. No one is living upstairs yet. My grandma usually goes watch my little cousins at my uncle's place across town, so I'm usually home alone. I didn't mind being alone, but when I'm always entering then building to go into my grandma's house, I can hear someone walking down the stairs from the top level to peak who is in the building, so I usually rush to get inside. I sleep in my aunt's room because she was traveling overseas. This one night, in her room, I woke up to a loud, continuous banging on her desk. It was 3 a.m. in the morning. What only given me light was the moon shining out of the window for me to see in the room. So I panned around the room. I saw a familiar figure I've seen at the beach area. It was the lady, all pitch black. All I saw was her glowy white eyes from her face. She was watching me sleep. She was waiting for me to sleep on my back to sleep on me, but that wasn't going to happen. I was too tired to be scared, so I fell back to sleep. But I can hear it smiling while it looked down, staring at me like it was so happily hungry. But I was strong enough to ignore it, and it lost interest at the moment. Every night was different. There will be times where in the kitchen I hear dishes clanging together and footsteps upstairs. When my grandma arrived days later, I told her what happened. But she made excuses and was in denial. But she's right. There's nothing here. But it adds up that I was being followed. So I told my grandma to ask a shaman for me of why this spirit has followed me. Shaman has said you came across this spirit, and this spirit really likes you. Her past life, she'd been killed by her boyfriend while she had a baby coming soon. So it was a coincidence coming across this entity. So after they tied red strings over my siblings and performed rituals for every else and my friends. So don't go cruising late teens. You'll run across a spirit. As for my sister, there's something else in her room. Story 4. The Last Goodbye. My grandma's mysterious visitor. Sitting next to my grandma, who was peacefully asleep in her bed. I remember the last several nights. She had been hallucinating. She could not sleep for several evenings. She kept telling the family that she was afraid of death. My grandma had her bedroom lights on every night for the past week. She kept saying there's people who's waiting for her. I remembered my grandma being very paranoid. She had her flashlight with her everywhere she went in the house. One prior evening, while watching her dozing off and on in the middle of the night, she just jumped up on her bed, scaring the shit out of me. For some odd reason, her cozy, warm room just became cold. My grandma pointed at the footboard of the bed, being terrified, said, "Thereheis, Thereheis, help me. He's coming for me." Me being scared, I yelled, "Grandma, where?" I frantically looking everywhere with the blankets half covering my face. My grandma just kept pointing at the footboard where her eyes focused. My arms filled with goosebumps and all my hair raised up. I looked everywhere and still did not see a darn thing. I had to be brave. I told my grandma that she was just dreaming. My grandma yelled, "HEEZONTHEBEDHASCOMING," while she kicked violently under the blanket, as if she was kicking at some body or something. I was so scared I covered my face, shaking to myself. And then it hit me. I had to help my grandma overcome this fear. I slowly peeked behind the blankets and did not see anything. I got up from the rocking chair and hugged onto my grandma. I said, "Don't be scared, Grandma. I'm here. I won't let them take you away." My grandma, crying in my arms, like a little child who was in need of their mother. I held onto my petite grandma, feeling helplessly. She hiding her face in my arms, sobbing away. After a few minutes, my grandma looked up at me, her face full of fear, eyes filled with tears, and breathless. She said, "Do you believe me? Or am I just a crazy grandma to you?" I didn't know how to answer. I didn't want her to be disappointed. I just told her everything will be fine. Later on that day, I asked my grandma what she had seen. She said for the last few nights, there's been a white guy. He is tall, wearing a black suit. He has short gray hair, a long face with a scarf wrapped around his mouth. Half of his face under his scarf is torn off. He called himself Francis. At first, he only appeared in the dark or hid in the shadows watching her. But for the last few days, he didn't care anymore and would come out during all hours of light. My grandma said he claims to be the guide to help her go to the next life. My grandma explained every time before he appeared and afterwards, she would smell a strong odor of sweet, flowery scent. She's afraid and was not ready to go. I was just surprised at what my grandma had just told me. Me think to myself, Francis. How the hell did she come up with a name like Francis? She could barely speak English. I just shrugged it off, thinking it may have been a name she got from watching television. But back to that evening, as I watched her sleeping like a baby for the first time in weeks, my heart was put at ease. I remembered thinking to myself, hopefully Grandma is back to normal now, and we could get some sleep in. As I slowly rock myself in this rocking chair, I feel asleep. It felt like I had just closed my eyes when someone touched me. I woke up to see my grandma walking around in the room. I was surprised that I didn't hear her get up from the bed. I'm thinking she's probably losing it again. I asked, Grandma, what are you doing? My grandma just ignored me and walked into her closet. Darn, I better get up and see what's Grandma doing. As I walked up to the closet, my grandma came out. In her arms, she had a black garbage bag with strings tied around. My grandma came up to me and said, "This is for you. It was made by Mother, and now it's yours." As my grandma handed me the package, a knock came from the door. I looked towards the door, and my grandma said, "Come in, I'm ready." I asked Grandma, "Ready for what?" I looked at the door and see a Caucasian man in black suit at the doorway. He had gray hair with a scarf partially covering his mouth. My heart started to pound hard. I didn't believe what I was seeing. I tried to talk, but I was too scared to say a word. I just froze as I stared at this man, the man my grandma had been telling me all about. My grandma turned towards me and said, "That is Francis. I'm not afraid anymore. Your dad is here with him." Seconds later, I heard another voice coming behind Francis. It sounded like my dad. He said, "Mom, are you ready?" As he came towards the doorway, I looked at the doorway and I couldn't believe my eyes. Tears just started to flow down my cheeks. "D, is it really you?" He just waved and smiled at me. Him wearing a traditional Hmong outfit while holding onto a rope. He said, "Yes, it's me. It's been a while, my girl." I got up and walked towards Francis and my dad. As I got close to the doorway, my grandma held onto my arm. My grandma said, "It's not your time, child." My dad, looking at me, also said, "I'm sorry, but you can't come with us. Your grandma will be all right." My grandma hugged me and said, "Take care of your siblings. I will be okay." I just kept crying, unknown if this is a dream or if it was real. I just missed my dad so much. I just wanted one hug. My dad said, "Mom, hurry. Dad is at the garden waiting for us. I brought Dad's ox so you can ride him back." I just watched in tears as my grandma walked out the room. I saw Francis close the door behind. I sat back on the rocking chair and just cried to myself. I felt a touch to my shoulder. I looked up to see my mom. My mom said, "Wake up, what's wrong?" I look up to be relieved that it was a dream. I turned to see my grandma still sleeping in her bed next to me. My mom then said, Why does Grandma's room smell so flowery? I was just in shock. I couldn't answer my mom. My mom went to my grandma. She said, "Grandma, are you okay?" I watched my mom as she started crying. My mom called out for my stepdad to come in the room. My mom turned towards me and said, Grandma had left us. My mom hugging onto my grandma. I was in disbelief as I got up a black bag with strings tied around it, dropped to the ground from my lap. I didn't know what to say or believe. I just cried quietly to myself, knowing that my grandma is with my dad and grandpa in a better place. Story 5. Quick back. My husband and I had been together for about 6 years and recently got married and moved out of his parents' place. When we were still dating, we would go out super late together on the weekends. He would end up driving home alone by himself after dropping me off. On his way home, he would usually have to drive through a dark wooded road. It was a short distance, but seemed like it took forever to drive through when it was dark. One night while going home from dropping me off, he felt like something wasn't right. When he finally arrived to his house and got out of the car, he noticed someone slashed something sitting in the back seat of his car. He didn't think much of it, since he was so tired and just headed inside. A few nights later, he told me about having sleep paralysis, and that he has never experienced anything like that before. He would then continue to have sleep paralysis once or twice every month for the next few years. Fast forward a couple years later, him and I got married. A few months after getting married, we moved into our first apartment together. My dad is a shaman, so I had him come and cleanse our apartment before moving any furniture in. Everything was well for the first few months, and my husband didn't really experience his sleep paralysis anymore. Now my husband works earlier than me, so I would always roll over to his side of the bed while sleeping and take up the whole bed. He sleeps on the left side of the bed and our dresser is right next to him. One morning when he left for work, as usual, I rolled over to his side of the bed and fell asleep, facing the dresser. A couple minutes later, I heard our bedroom door open and felt someone walking over to our bed. I thought it was just my husband coming back in for something before he left for work, so I closed my eyes and tried going back to sleep. As I was drifting off into my sleep, I felt as if my husband had come back and laid down next to me on my side of the bed and wrapped his arms around me. So I questioned him sleepily. "Why are you back? Are you not going to work today or something?" But I got no response. I then moved my hand over to hold his hand, but what I felt were not my husband's hands. The hands that I held were cold and almost womanly skinny, small, smooth, and long fingers. I knew right away that his wasn't my husband and tried moving away, but I was stuck. Whatever it was holding me in place and wouldn't let me move or speak. When I finally awoke, I was sweating and my heart was beating so fast. A couple of months later, when during deer hunting season, my husband left with his dad and brothers to go hunting for the weekend. The first night I slept alone was fine. I slept throughout the whole night. The second night, while I was sleeping, again, I rolled over to my husband's side of the bed and fell asleep there. I was awakened in the middle of the night. I could feel the bed moving as if someone was crawling onto the bed to go to sleep. I knew that it wasn't my husband, for he had already left to go hunting, so I yelled at it, telling it not to bother me, that it was getting me pissed off, and that I was going to get my dad on their ass since he was a shaman. Well, I guess whatever I had said got it pissed off, so it pinned my shoulders down and sat right on top of my stomach, not allowing me to move. I tried kicking, yelling, and punching, but nothing worked. It felt like forever. When I finally got out of the paralysis, I realized that it's only been happening to me whenever I was asleep on my husband's side of the bed. So I decided to test my theory out once again a few weeks later, and sure enough, Whatever it is, only came whenever I was on his side of the bed because I got sleep paralysis, a GAIN. So I'm starting to think that whatever followed my husband home that one night, years ago, is still bothering him until today, and is angry that I slept where he slept. I told my mom, and she had my dad tie a few strings on my husband and got us some protective/lucky charms. I don't know if he is still experiencing his sleep paralysis, but he doesn't allow me to sleep on his side of the bed anymore, afraid that whatever it is will come and mess with me again. Story 6. Whispers of the Funeral Night. This happened back in Thailand when I was 6 years old. It was nighttime, and only my uncle was around to look after me. I had fallen asleep on a bench outside, but at some point, I woke up and asked him where my parents were. He told me they had gone to a funeral at my grandmother's house. Knowing where her house was, I decided to walk there by myself. It was about 6 blocks from home. I quietly slipped away without my uncle noticing. As I got close, around the 5th block, I heard the sounds of gongs and a commotion coming from the direction of my grandmother's house. When I looked closer, I saw water jugs lined up outside and a butchered pig hanging nearby. Then, something else caught my eye. A large bamboo sieve, the kind used to sift rice, lay on the ground. On top of it stood a little girl, dressed entirely in white, with long black hair that reached the ground. She was facing the house, standing eerily still. I felt a chill run down my spine and screamed in terror. Hearing my cries, my mother came rushing out to get me. I told her everything I'd seen. By the next morning, word had spread throughout the town, and people stopped me to ask about it wherever I went. The story soon turned into a rumor that the spirit of my second grandmother had returned to take my grandfather away. The funeral that night had been for him. Story 7. The Hmong Girl by the River. My dad once shared a chilling story with my siblings and me. A story that he and my aunt had lived through as children back in Laos. It was about a strange encounter they had one early morning on our family's farm, a meeting with a girl who was no longer alive. When my dad and his sister, my aunt, were young, they often went to the family farm to help with chores. One morning, just before dawn, they set out while it was still dim outside. Before they left, their grandmother reminded them to stay on the farm and not wander off. They both agreed, and off they went. As they arrived at the farm, my dad noticed something unusual. There were footprints scattered through the soil, as though someone had been walking through the crops. He felt a surge of curiosity and told his sister to wait while he went to look around, hoping to catch whoever it was. While my dad searched, my aunt waited quietly, seated on a small patch of ground. A little while later, he returned to find her laughing and talking to another girl who seemed to be around her age. My dad walked closer, and as he did, he saw that this girl looked strange. Her skin was ghostly pale, and she had no shoes on her feet despite the cold morning air. As he approached, the girl turned to him with a soft smile. "Where are you from?" he asked, curious about this mysterious visitor. The girl pointed across the river to a distant village. "I'm from over there," she said quietly. And then, as if remembering something, added, "I have to go. My parents have been looking for me for a while now." With that, she ran down the hill, her figure vanishing around the bend. When the girl was gone, my dad told his sister they should head back home and come back later with their grandmother. There was something unsettling about the encounter, something he couldn't quite place. As they made their way back, they saw a group of people gathered by the riverbank. Cries of grief filled the air. My dad recognized his grandmother among the crowd, so he and his sister ran to her and asked what had happened. Their grandmother told them that a Hmong family from the other village had come to the river for a picnic. While the family ate, their daughter asked if she could go for a quick swim. They had agreed, but after a few minutes, she was gone. They had called her name over and over, but she never returned. Only now had they found her, her small body floating near the edge of the water. The words had barely sunk in when my aunt froze, staring at the girl's lifeless form. She turned to my dad, her face pale with realization, and whispered, "It was her, she was the girl I was playing with." She said she wanted someone to play with and asked me to join her. She was so nice, she even invited me to swim, but I told her I had to wait for you, brother. My aunt continued, her voice shaking, "While you were looking around. She told me she had been stepping on our farm because her feet were cold from the river, and she wanted to warm them." My dad, too, was horrified. He looked at the girl by the river, and he knew it was the same girl he'd seen minutes before. The deathly pale face, the bare feet, it was all the same. Their grandmother, sensing the fear in their voices, hurried them back home. She took them straight to their grandfather, where they burned incense, tied protective strings around their wrists and necks, and called their spirits back, performing the traditional rites meant to protect them from any spirits they had encountered. After that day, my dad and his sister never saw the girl again, and they never went anywhere alone without their grandparents. Hearing this story that night chilled me to the core, and I couldn't sleep afterward, haunted by the image of the pale girl by the river, searching for a friend. Story 8. The Haunting Price of Vengeance. I'm going to tell this story exactly how I heard it. Out of respect for the family, I won't mention any names, but I can tell you it's a true story of something dark, something unnatural. The victim in this story was my wife's uncle. He'd just bought a house at a great price in a good neighborhood, a cozy place that any family would call home. A cemetery lay just behind the property, but it didn't bother him. He wasn't one to be superstitious. His only real annoyance was the raccoons that kept getting into his trash, leaving garbage strewn across his yard. Frustrated, he finally decided to handle it himself. One night, with his garbage cans full and ready to attract the raccoons, he waited in his garage, armed with a high-powered air rifle. When they appeared, he took aim and fired, hitting one, then another, then a third, until the rest scattered. He felt satisfied as he bagged the bodies, tossed them into the trash, and headed back inside. But then he heard a voice, an angry, irate voice, calling his name from somewhere near the cemetery. When he looked, he saw an old woman standing there, yelling at him. She told him he had killed her children just because they were hungry, and warned that on a certain day and time, she would come for him. He shrugged it off, figuring she was just a homeless woman or maybe drunk, lost in the cemetery. He dismissed her words and went back inside. Months passed. One day, after work, he came home, got ready to shower, and as he stepped into the tub, he blacked out. Paramedics rushed him to the ER, but doctors couldn't explain what was wrong. His vitals all seemed normal, but something was clearly wrong. An MRI revealed the unthinkable somehow. All his organs had been pulled downward, as if some invisible force had crushed them into the lower part of his body. There was nothing the doctors could do. They told the family he wouldn't survive. In his final days, he finally shared the story with my father-in-law, telling him about that night with the raccoons and the old woman's warning. But by then, it was too late. He slipped into a coma and passed away soon after. His funeral was held at a local home that rarely catered to Hmong families, but they did everything to make us comfortable. the first 2 nights, everything went smoothly. Then, on the 3rd night, around 11 p.m., when the last few people were finishing up, the owner of the funeral home did a final check. Everyone had left, and he was alone. With some paperwork left to do, he decided to stay a little longer. The building was eerily silent. And then knock, knock. The sound hit him hard, like a shock. He was sure he was alone. He double-checked. He swallowed hard, heart pounding, and heard it again, knock, knock. He called out, "Who's there?" No answer. Did someone get left behind? Silence. Cautiously, he opened the door just a crack. And there stood my wife's uncle, holding his own coffin in one hand. In a tired voice, he said, "I just want to go home." The owner slammed the door shut and immediately called 911. The police arrived, did a full sweep, and found nothing out of place except for faint drag marks on the carpet, leading from the coffin to the office door. Since that night, the funeral home has refused to cater to home funerals. My wife's uncle died a violent, unexplained death that has left us all shaken. Whether he ignored something supernatural or was just cursed by bad luck, we may never know. Story 9. Strangers at a Pub. A few years ago, Elle worked at a cafe and made friends with this chick named Sam. We used to open up the store early in the morning. She was the most cheery person working there and would always pat me on the back when we first saw each other. One day, she had to get up on a ladder for something on the top shelf, slipped, fell, and got a bad injury, which she passed away from. Dumb, right? I know. Anyway, it was not the same working the morning shift without her, so I decided to learn how to bake and work overnight. I trained for a month, and when Elle was done, Elle would bake with no one else in the cafe. I was familiar with all of the sounds at night. I generally hear the oven, ice machine, dishwasher, and other small noises. After a while, I noticed that at 3 in the morning, it would sound like there was someone walking around the cafe. The steps would start in the back, near the driver, through window, pass by the line where food was prepared, the dining area, into the baker's area, then back to the drive-through area. The light footsteps sounded as if someone was walking around the cafe 2 or 3 laps every night, and it would always happen in the same hour. Those steps were vaguely familiar, but I could not make out why that was. I get the chills every time it comes into the baker's area and pass right behind me. Whatever was happening gave me goosebumps but did not bother me, so I left it alone. During the winter, things got strange. The night workers started quitting one by one, and because we were so short-staffed, we eventually closed the cafe at 6 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. Usually when I'd come in, the crew would be cleaning up, but because of the store hours changing, only my assistant would be in and leave around 11. One winter night, I was working alone as usual, but somewhere around midnight, things got very strange. I felt as if something came up to me from behind, jumped on my back, and caused this wave of depression wash over me. When that happened, all of these negative thoughts entered my mind. Your friends secretly hate you. This girl is out trying to get into deep trouble. Family friends are spreading rumors about you. Your coworkers think that you are annoying. It was as if everyone that was not in the room had something against me. My mind felt like a prison cell. I felt so much anxiety from the top of my head all the way down to my toes. My head was getting heavy, and it kept hanging lower and lower. If my mama saw my face, I'm sure that she'd say that it looked dubbed Niam. I couldn't help it though. It was as if my face decided to express itself in that way, and I couldn't make out any other expression. I didn't know what to do. I really wanted to shake this feeling, but all I could do was continue working. The night went on, and I was trying everything that I can to feel okay. Happy thoughts, music, affirmations. Nothing was working, and I just kept feeling worse and worse as the night progressed. 3 a.m. came around, and by this time, I was spooked as hell. I know what happens at 3 a.m. in this cafe. I heard the footsteps, as usual. It started in the same way. Back corner where the drive-through window is, down the same line, dining room as usual. And before it went back to the drive-through window where it started, the steps came into the baker's area. Tonight was a little different though, because normally the sounds of the steps would be consistent throughout. But when it entered my space, it got louder and more timid. I was so terrified. I told myself that if that thing walks any closer to me, I was going to bust out in tears and have a breakdown. The wave of anxiety still washed over my whole body, and my head was still hanging low as these steps approached me. It came closer and closer until I swear that this was the most real and physical thing that I have ever felt in my life from something that I could not see. I felt a hand land on my back. I thought that I was going to have a breakdown from that walking spirit, but I actually got the opposite effect. All of the anxiety and overwhelming depression suddenly left my body. My head felt light. No more negative thoughts automatically running through my mind. My face expression was Laj Siab, refreshing. I could easily put on a smile if I wanted to. I got the chills, good chills, kind of like when you eat spicy food. Have to take a spicy dump, and your stomach feels great afterwards. I just felt good overall. This was when things started to click. I recognized those footsteps, and those vague memories of my friend became clear to me. I remembered her as if I just saw her this morning, laughing about how ridiculous the customers can get, sharing food with our coworkers, smack talking about the big bosses for the heck of it. The joy that I experienced when I would open the cafe came back to me. At that moment, I knew without a doubt that this whole time I've been working, it was Sam circling the cafe every night, somehow protecting the place. About a month ago, this guy named Miji came up to me in a pub and started a conversation. He's talkative. The dude was conversing with every person in the place just for fun. Anyway, I bought him a drink and learned that he worked at the same cafe that I did from the good old days. I told him the story about that night and the footsteps that I'd hear whenever I would work. He responds with, "Are you talking about the spirit that circles the cafe at 3 in the morning?" Chills went down my spine. I did not tell him about the time that Sam came out. He then sarcastically says, "Yeah, she's my friend." We both laughed, and chills again for me, because I also left out the gender. We went back into the conversation more seriously, and he then explains how he's been on the spiritual path for 8 years and is currently a rising shaman. He told me that I have a 6th sense that Mikas, American people, call clairaudience. That's why I was able to hear the footsteps. He knew that Sam was circling the building because of his own 6th sense, clairvoyance, claircognizance. According to him, she passed away doing what she loved and continues to watch over the place by doing spiritual work. And her walking around the cafe was like how we Hmong people Cheb Tevi. When we finished our drinks, he says, "You're lucky that you didn't work at Green Bay East. That's the most haunted cafe." Side note. Us bakers baked at different cafes depending on where we are needed. But we have a main cafe that we bake at. He pats me on the back and goes to karaoke or whatnot. From the way that he patted my back, I just knew that there was some kind of metaphysical connection going on. It showed in his demeanor that some part of him had met Sam. Story 10. The Mirror's Haunting Possession. It was the summer of 2009, in mid-July, when I first noticed that something was off. Every time I looked in the bathroom mirror, instead of my own reflection, I saw a woman in a white gown staring back at me. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining it, but the vision persisted. One day, I looked closely and saw her face clearly. She wore a long white gown. Her hair hung down past her shoulders, and her pale skin was marked by large boils that seemed to pulse. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, she was there, as though she was inside of me. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw her instead of me. I didn't tell my parents. I knew they wouldn't believe me. One night, after dinner, I went to bed early to rest up before helping my mom sell her crafts at the carnival the next day. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I saw two women in black dresses with long, dark hair standing by my bed, one by my feet, smiling, and the other by my side, also smiling. I brushed it off, thinking I must be imagining things. The next morning, something felt terribly wrong. I felt like my spirit was trapped, entangled in a mass of thorns, with a light in the distance that I couldn't reach. My body felt foreign, as though someone else had taken control of it. I tried to go back to sleep, hoping the feeling would pass. My mom came into my room to wake me up, but I just stared at her blankly and went back to sleep. My dad tried too, but it was like I was no longer there. Days passed, and I felt myself slipping further away. I became cruel, lashing out at my family, skipping church, and locking myself in my room. Then, one of the women in black appeared again and whispered that they needed my body for their master, who wanted to live through me. I was the perfect host, she said. This continued for a week and a half, until one night, my mom asked me to do the dishes. I glared at her and went straight to bed instead. She followed me, asking why I was acting this way, saying I wasn't myself anymore. In that moment, I broke down, crying a horrifying, desperate cry and screamed, "Mom, help me! Mommy, help me! I can see the light, but I can't reach it. The thorns are hurting me. Help me!" My dad rushed in, ready to discipline me, but my mom stopped him, saying I was no longer their daughter. Something else had taken over. She told my dad to call the pastor. As he did, my mom spoke to the three women, begging them to give her daughter back. The moment the pastor arrived, I stopped crying. My body turned cold, pale. I explained to him what had been happening, and he prayed over me, banishing the spirits from my body. Gradually, I felt my spirit return, warmth spreading through me once again. I was exhausted but relieved, grateful to see my parents again. But it wasn't over. The next day, one of the women appeared at my door, angry and glaring. The following night, the woman from the mirror returned, and the third night, the last woman came, all of them furious. I didn't care. As long as I was safe, I ignored them. 2 years later, in 2011, I thought it was finally over. But one night, as I slept, I had a nightmare. 2 children with rotten faces appeared, telling me they were there to take me to hell to live with their mother. The woman in the mirror I had banished. I resisted, but they tried to drag me away. Suddenly, I heard a beautiful voice singing the Christian hymn Teshuvi Yexis Lub NP. As it reached the Hallelujah part, the children recoiled in fear. One left immediately, while the other clung to me, still trying to pull me down. But when the voice returned, even stronger this time, the last child gave up and vanished through the window. I woke up shaken, knowing that while they might still be out there, I had escaped. For now. Story 11. Father-in-law. Not too long ago, my wife lost her mom. She was only 64, still so full of life. She and my father-in-law had both retired early after selling their donut shop. Yeah, an Asian donut shop. Losing her hit him really hard. With some health issues of his own, we were all worried about him. Eventually, we convinced him to sell his house while the market was good, and he moved in with us. They had sons, but it was always my wife and I they seemed to favor, so bringing him into our home was a no-brainer, especially since we had a baby on the way. Maybe having a grandkid around would help him heal. At first, it was tough. He barely ate or spoke. All he'd do was listen to old voicemails from his wife. It was heartbreaking, but after a few months, he started to come around eating more, talking a bit. You could still see that sadness in his eyes, though. With COVID still around, we couldn't go anywhere, and that isolation made things harder for him. Then, a few weeks ago, he got really sick. We thought it might be COVID, but every test came back negative. At night, we'd hear him coughing or moaning, sometimes even a loud thud from his room. When we'd go in, he'd be sitting straight up, staring at the wall. My wife thought he was showing signs of dementia, but I didn't think he was old enough. One afternoon, my wife went out grocery shopping, and while she was gone, I heard him calling for me from his room. Kua, Kawa, hurry, please. I rushed to his room, but he wasn't there. I looked around the yard, thinking maybe he'd wandered outside, but he called out to me again from the house. I ran back in, checked his room again, and still nothing. Just then, my wife came through the door with the groceries, and there he was, helping her carry bags inside. I asked him where he'd been, and my wife told me he had gone to the store with her. The whole thing gave me chills, but I decided not to say anything until we were alone. That night, I told my wife what had happened. She asked if I was sure, and I told her 100%. We were trying to make sense of it when we suddenly heard my father-in-law shout from his room. We ran over, and there he was, asleep on his side. I sat on his bed and gently shook him awake. He looked up, then suddenly froze, staring past me toward the door. My wife was standing there, and we both turned to see what he was looking at. Standing behind her was a tall, dark figure covered in long black hair. It looked like it was made of hair, arms, legs, even its face. Before I could yell, it called out, "Kua!" in my father-in-law's voice. The door slammed, trapping my wife outside, and in a split second, that thing grabbed her and started dragging her down the hallway. I tried to go after her, but my body felt so weak, like I was in a nightmare. I couldn't move. I fell to the floor, and my head hit the wall hard. I turned to look back, and I could see my father-in-law still sitting on his bed, crying out in Hmong, "Koje Nyam, Thove Pab W2's me Nuxais O's. Wife, please help our dear daughter." He repeated it over and over, pleading for help. Then, I felt something rush by me, like a chill up my spine. It was silent, but I could feel it, like footsteps moving fast towards my wife. There was a loud thud from the living room, and suddenly my wife came running back to me. Everything felt normal again. She threw herself into my arms, and I called out to my father-in-law. He answered, and we went back to his room to hug him. He looked at us and said, "Your mom, she loves you so much." Later, we sat down with my wife's uncle, who isn't a shaman but has a spiritual gift. He walked around the house and then told us he felt the lingering presence of my wife's mother. She was there, but something else was too. He called it a pa jen tuksug, A troll from Hmong folklore. We couldn't smell anything, but he said it had a distinct spiritual scent. To keep it from returning, he mixed herbs and salt, grinding them into dust in a clay pot. Then he circled the house, speaking in what sounded like ancient Hmong poetry. Since then, things have been peaceful. My wife's pregnancy is going well, and my father-in-law seems healthier. But I still see that Pojane Tuksug in my dreams, calling for me. Story 12. The Haunting of the Green Blanket. There's an old saying that goes, "Never take anything that belongs to the dead, or they'll come back for it." Here's my story. My ex-husband and I are Christian, but his family still holds on to some older traditions. From the moment I entered their house, I felt something was off. My spirit sensed the presence of a little girl in a black dress, roaming the house and spending most of her time in my ex-in-law's closet. One night, she came to me in a dream and said she wouldn't bother me. She was staying only because she wanted to be close to her parents. The next day, I saw a picture of her and asked my ex-mother-in-law about it. She told me it was her daughter, who had tragically drowned at age 3. In May 2011, I had my daughter, and my ex-mother-in-law gifted her a big, fluffy green blanket. Not long after, my ex-husband and I moved into our own apartment, but I noticed a strange coldness and an uneasy feeling there. I knew the blanket had belonged to his little sister who'd passed, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Night after night, my daughter began acting strangely. She'd point to the ceiling, make odd faces, look around as if following something unseen, and sometimes cry and become upset. After she turned one, she started sleepwalking, often waking to stare intently at a corner of the room or out the window. This continued for over a year, but I didn't throw away the blanket because she loved it so much. After my divorce, in 2013, my daughter and I moved back in with my parents in Georgia, and that's when things escalated. The little girl's spirit seemed to follow us. She would argue with my daughter over the blanket, causing my daughter to cough and even vomit when she was angry. The spirit would knock things down in our room, making her presence known. I could feel where she was, and I would shout at her to stop, but she ignored me. When I finally told my mother, she explained that the spirit was likely attached to us because we had something that belonged to her, the blanket. I decided it was time to let go, so I asked my mom to get rid of it. I told the little girl that the blanket was gone and she needed to move on. After that, my daughter stopped coughing, was able to sleep peacefully, and has been fine ever since. Now, we can finally rest easy. Story 13. A Ghost Ride Home. About 25 years ago, my family and my sister-in-law, who was living with us at the time, went to my other brother-in-law's house to celebrate a nephew's birthday. Everyone was having a great time eating, celebrating, and sharing ghost stories from Laos. For those of us who were scared easily, we clung to the edge of the sofas or sat with clenched teeth. Some of those Pojane Tuksug stories were so terrifying that we were still shaking as we got into the car to head home. When it was time to leave, it seemed like everyone left the house at once. I had my 2 toddlers and my 9-year-old in the back seat, along with my sister-in-law, while I held the baby in the front with my husband driving. After about 15 minutes on the road, we reached a dark, rural stretch with no streetlights. Out of nowhere, my sister-in-law whispered, "Sister, who is this riding with us?" I glanced around and saw no one unusual, so I replied, "No one." But she insisted, "Sister, she's sitting right behind you. That's why you can't see her." I asked, "What does she look like?" She answered, She has long hair and big round eyes. At that point, my sister-in-law and I both jumped, startling everyone else in the car. My husband just kept driving, too shocked to speak, until we finally got home. As we all got out of the car, the little girl who'd been with us slipped out quietly and disappeared into the night. It turned out she'd gotten into the wrong car by mistake. We called my brother-in-law and the girl's parents, who were already home. They hadn't even realized they'd left her behind. In the end, I think we may have scared her more than she scared us. Thank you for always supporting the channel and welcoming its videos. Wishing you good health, and remember to subscribe to the channel to achieve 1,000 subscriptions.